Hello, welcome back to 78 Reflections. My name is Patty Lane, and I'm so glad you're here. Today, I'm responding to the topic of tarot collections. And I have really been enjoying watching these videos and hearing the different perspectives. And I'll be honest, it's really kind of opened my eyes to see things in a slightly different way. And so I thought I would add my voice to the conversation in case anyone is interested. I hope someone is. But I want to start by saying that I actually find it a bit strange that we call our tarot decks a collection. And the reason for that is because when I hear collection, I think of acquiring things for display or rarity. And that's just not how I relate to tarot decks. For me, tarot decks are much closer to books. And if someone buys books to read or reference, I don't think we call them book collectors. So why are we tarot collectors? So maybe I'm being overly pedantic about this. But instead of thinking of my decks as a collection, I refer to them as a working tarot library. Decks I use, study, and learn from. So throughout this video, I'm not really going to be talking about collection. I'm going to be talking about my tarot library. So with that being said, I'm just going to jump right in. So question number 1, how long have I been purchasing decks? Well, I purchased my first 2 tarot decks in 2021. And the first 2 decks were these 2 at the top here, the Radiant Wise Spirit and the Paulina Tarot. And I have 5 decks here because in my first 2 years of learning and reading tarot, these were the 6 decks that I worked with. So I purchased all, well, there's one missing. The Lightseers Tarot I no longer have, which I'll talk about later in another question. But I had 6 decks. I purchased them all in 2021. In 2022, I did not acquire additional decks. I just worked with these. And as I'm talking, rather than looking at a still stack of decks, I'm just going to start flipping through them. So my daughter introduced me to tarot. And I used Oracle decks before that. And when she introduced me to tarot, she was very insistent that a person should learn from the traditional Waite-Smith imagery. And I don't disagree with her. So I did quite a lot of research trying to figure out what would be the first deck, the best deck to get. And I'll admit, I didn't know anything about decks. So I didn't know anything about cardstock. I didn't really think about certain things. Like, I know some people really like this background. I don't really like the color orange. So I probably would have, if I were to do this over, I probably would have done the Centennial or something like that. But that's neither here nor there. This was my first deck. And I do love it. I tend to keep it in order because I do reference this deck a lot. And I don't use it for readings typically. But this was my very... Well, like I purchased these 2 decks at the same time, and I'll explain why. So tarot was something that, because of my upbringing, I actually had a lot of fear around it. And as I started to get more comfortable with it, some of the imagery still felt quite jarring to me. And so how I navigated that was by purchasing a softer deck with quite a lot of symbolism in it so that I could learn about them by comparing them. So if there was a card that was particularly challenging for me in this typical imagery, then I would be able to offset that by looking at the imagery in the Paulina Tarot. So the Paulina Tarot, I chose that deck because I'm very connected to Fae energy. And I just thought that this deck was beautiful. I still believe this deck is beautiful, not past tense. And what's interesting is there's a lot of symbolism packed in. And don't let the guidebook don't think just because this guidebook is small that it's not good, because it's very good. And there's a lot of imagery in this deck. And so for the first couple of months, I just worked with those 2 decks. And then over, kind of the rest of that year, I ended up acquiring those 4 additional decks as well. And the guidebook that I learned from in the early days was also recommended by my daughter. And that was the Tarot Bible. Now I think this book is quite interesting, but you can probably tell it's actually not very well used. I did reference it, but in the beginning, I probably relied a lot more on people's videos, and the Brinth, for example, I watch her videos. Today, if a friend wants to learn tarot, I actually recommend Lisa Pepez's book, Unlocking the Tarot. You can see this book is very well worn and used. I have sticky notes, I write in it. Like, this is my tarot Bible. But, actually it was interesting because there was, going back to my roots series in January. And I wish I would have had the bandwidth to do it, because if I did, I would have used this Paulina deck and also the Tarot Bible. Maybe I still will. I just did not have time in January. I had other plans. So that's the first question. How long have you been purchasing decks? Since 2021. What kind of library do I have? Well, let's take a look at another deck. Let's look at this one. I love this deck. This is the Llewellyn Tarot, modified, as you can see. If I had to describe my tarot library, I would say it's a working reference library. Each deck that I have adds something to my understanding. A different type of imagery. I may have purchased it because I really wanted to use the guidebook. I've bought decks often because I heard or saw through a walkthrough that the guidebook was really good. Maybe there's a different perspective in the archetypes. I definitely went through a phase, kind of last year, of wanting to fill in some gaps. Like, I didn't have a black and white deck, and I didn't have a Marseille deck. So from that perspective, maybe you might describe it as kind of utilitarian, but I don't know, that seems cold. So I would say a working reference library. And I do use them every single day. I work with the tarot. So I do use them, and some I definitely work with more than less, but I try to be really intentional with how I work with my decks. Question number 3, am I a completionist? No, I would not consider myself a completionist. I do sometimes purchase decks from the same creator. So this is one example. I have these 2 MJ Cullinane decks, but I don't necessarily feel because I have these 2, I need to buy all of her decks. But if I do really like a creator, I might be more likely to take a closer look. But I would not consider myself a completionist. Question 4, how do I store or organize my decks? Okay, I'm going to try to show you. But hopefully I don't do anything. Okay, there we go. I think that might work. So, sorry if I'm making anyone seasick. So I don't know if you can see this. So this is like, it has 3 compartments, And I love this. I got this at HomeSense here in Canada. I don't know if you guys have a similar HomeSense, but sort of like Marshall's. And so what I do is if a deck comes in a tuck box or if it comes in a obnoxiously big box like Llewellyn, I will put them in a bag like this, and then I store them in here. I have two like this. I have the black one with white, and then I have a white one with black, and I love them both. And so those go on the top shelf of my bedside table. And then in the bottom shelf, I'm not gonna be able to show you, but I have a large plastic container that fits all the decks that are kept in their boxes. So I am keeping this one in the tuck box because, well, frankly, I don't use that deck. But if it comes in a decent box, like these ones, for example, I just keep them in my box, in their box, put them in the plastic container and slide them into the shelf. I like it. I like it. It works well. It's also because it's quite limited. When I think about purchasing a new deck, I'm like, well, where's it going to go? What is my favorite thing about my library? Well, let me find another deck to show you first. How about the John Bauer? This John Bauer deck I never really connected with. And I know there is someone on YouTube who's talking about making this into an oracle. And I thought maybe I could make it into my own, sort of along the style of Into the Lonely Woods. But I digress. What is my favorite thing about my library? You know, I have a lot of different decks to explore. I feel like I have pretty good variety. And so I use them. I think that's my favorite thing, is that I do absolutely use my decks. I use decks every single day. I try to rotate the decks that I'm working with approximately every 3 weeks. And then on Wednesdays, I do Wildcard Wednesdays, where I do the wheel spinner online. It's just a wheel spinner website. And I put all my decks into a wheel and I'll spin the wheel. And that's the deck I'm working with that day. So what is my least favorite thing? I don't think I have a least favorite thing. I can't think of one. Questions 7 and 8. What are my biggest and smallest categories? So I am approaching this maybe a little bit differently than some others have. But I tend to look at my decks thematically rather than by systems. So that's how I'm going to answer this question. So I have my deck inventory all put into categories. They're not perfect. And I'm sure if you asked 5 different tarot readers what category a deck belonged in, they would say something different. But it's my tarot library, so I get to decide. So for the biggest category thematically, I would say esoteric decks. And when I say esoteric, I mean decks that lean into layered symbolism, maybe spiritual philosophy or non-traditional structures. So these are decks that invite deeper reflection. And because I use my decks to learn and study, I think it makes sense that esoteric is my biggest category. So this deck, when I was in New Orleans, I went on a voodoo tour. I know that's not how you pronounce it, but I'm going to go with how people tend to pronounce it because I don't remember how. But if you're from New Orleans, you want to correct me, please do. Or if you know. But when I saw this deck in one of the stores I wandered into, I was just really fascinated by it. And I thought I could really learn not just about tarot, but about, you know, this voodoo, like the culture and the traditions. And you can see they've changed the suits. So this one is air or swords. This one is fire or wands. Congo, water. It's really interesting. The guidebook is good. The guidebook is really good. And I found a few videos on it. I want to learn more about this still. But I would definitely consider that my biggest category. And in case you're wondering what else I put in this category, let me just look at my inventory here. Star Tarot, Dreams of Gia, the Book of Shadows as above. Maybe I'll show you that one next. I think I have it here. I guess they're basically decks where I feel like the Waite-Smith knowledge doesn't help a whole bunch. I don't know if that makes sense. But this one, interestingly enough, the Book of Shadows as above deck, I have an esoteric, and then I have the Book of Shadows so below in my fairy fae category. Listen, it's my library. I get to decide, okay? So what's my smallest category? Well, I have a category that I call modern Waite-Smith clones. It's decks like the Millennial Tarot. I only have 3 in this category, so it's my smallest thematically category. This deck, you don't see this deck very often. But if you like modern decks, this one is really good, and it has a lot of diversity. And this one, I'll say the same thing about the guidebook. It's small, but it's quite mighty. So this is definitely my smallest category. I don't really love modern decks. And at this point in time, I do not read for the public. I do read occasionally for someone I know well. But if I ever wanted to read for the public, I feel like this is a deck a lot of people would really like. Look at that 4 of Wands. Isn't it fabulous? It gives a different take that really makes me think. It's like a mind twister. Oops. Maybe YouTube won't like that one because there was nudity. There isn't a ton of nudity, but there is some in here. But I do love this deck. It is my smallest category, though. Modern Waite-Smith clones. Do I have a holy grail? Well, let me tell you. I really had to think about this question because I don't really know if I understand the terminology of holy grail. But how I approached it is, what deck do I have that would be irreplaceable? And that would be this deck. So this deck is a tarot deck that I created using Soul Cards 1 and 2, the Oracle decks, available on Amazon. And so what I did was I took the 2 decks and I went through them and I chose the card that I thought best represented that particular. So for example, for strength, this was the card in the Soul decks that I thought best represented strength for me. It wasn't perfect because sometimes I wish there might have been a slightly different card. But the reason why I think this is a holy grail is because, first of all, this was done at a point in time in my journey. And it was not an original idea of mine. I got the idea from watching the Mindful Tarot. She did this. There were a bunch of YouTube creators. These were quite old videos, but there were a bunch of them. Look at this one. That's the 4 of Earth. Page of Cups. There were a bunch of creators that did them, and I watched all of their videos, and for some of them, I used the ones that they used. For some, I chose my own. But the reason why I consider this irreplaceable is because the cards I chose for each one were done at a point in time in my tarot journey, and I can never go back to that time and reselect the cards. I mean, I guess unless I filmed a flip through like I am right now, and then I just went through card by card and did the same thing. But I just don't think it would have the energy. I spent weeks doing this. And so this deck means a lot for me. I call it my inner crone deck. And when I want to hear what my inner crone has to say, I have an inner child deck and an inner crone deck. But when I want to know what my inner crone has to say, this deck never lets me down. Look at this card. This one is the Nine of Swords. Haunting. So I would consider this deck irreplaceable. And so I guess it's my holy grail. I don't know. Tell me if I'm wrong in the comments. Look at this Queen of Wands. I love this deck. Is my library too big, too small, or incomplete? Well, you know, is a library ever complete? I don't think so. What deck do you want to look at? I don't remember what I've shown, what I haven't shown. Let's look at this one. This one, I'm still kind of going through some of my top 6, my first 6 decks. This one is Dreamkeeper's Tarot. Right now, I feel content. But I will definitely be adding decks to my library. I just really want to be intentional about it. So put it this way. For my first 2 years, I had 6 decks. In my 3rd year, I added 6 more decks. And then in 24 and 25, I went a bit wild, if I'm being honest. And it's not that I have an issue with acquiring decks. I just want to do it intentionally. And so this year I am doing a low buy, but it's really about intentional spending. And you know, a lot of people filming these VRs have talked about how important it is to support small creators. And I 100% agree with that. And so for me, my thought is, you know, maybe I purchase an indie deck this year instead of purchasing a couple of mass market decks. I mean, I don't really know what I'm going to do. It feels a bit daunting when you live in Canada to purchase indie decks because they're expensive to begin with when you put them into Canadian dollars. But then also there's the shipping and the tariffs. And, you know, with the tariffs, you don't even really know. So, but that is something that I'm considering. But at this point in time, I just feel good about what I have. And I have a plan for which decks I want to work with this year. And I don't really have any gaps. So am I done purchasing tarot? No. Will I do it more mindfully? I hope so. How often do you declutter? Well, I don't experience my decks as clutter, but I do have a few decks like this John Bauer one that I don't really like and I don't really work with it. But I tend to want to hang on to things because the deck I just showed you, the Dreamkeeper Tarot, that was one of my first decks that I purchased. And I did find it quite hard to connect with initially. But over the last couple of years, I work with it a lot and I do really love it. So sometimes it might just be time and timing and where I'm at in my journey, where I'm at in my understanding, what sort of lights me up. So yeah, I don't declutter per se. I have, though, gifted decks to people. So for example, I mentioned that I had 6 decks in the first year and only 5 to show you. I did have a Lightseer Tarot. And when I had a friend who was interested in learning the tarot, I gifted her that deck because I thought she would really like it. And so I gave it to her as a gift. I have gifted a couple of decks to my daughter that I wasn't really resonating with and she loved. So, but yeah, so at this point in time, I would not considering decluttering anything from my collection. But sometimes I repurpose. So I have been known to convert tarot decks into oracle decks if they don't work for me as tarot decks. Who has the best collection videos? What should I show you next? I feel like I've kind of lost track of what I showed you and what I haven't. Have I shown you Llewellyn? Modified Llewellyn? I don't know if I'm in a position to give advice, so I am going to copy what someone else did. And they said, rather than giving advice to someone else, if I was to time travel back to the year of 2021, what would I tell myself? And I did write down a few things, so I'm just going to make sure I reference that here. First thing is, slow and mindful purchases will serve you better than impulse buys. Always watch walkthroughs, because the imagery and the guidebooks matter. Pay attention to deal breakers. So I have started to have pet peeves about it, whether it be cardstock, whether it be how certain cards are depicted. And so I really watch for those now before I purchase a new deck. More isn't better. So if, for example, I don't need a bunch of classic Waite-Smith imagery cards, even though I mentioned that, you know, if I were to repurchase my first deck, I'd probably do a Centennial just because I feel like I might like that one a bit more. But do I need a Centennial now? I don't think it brings anything different. So more isn't better. I think being realistic about your bandwidth. I do get really overwhelmed with too many things. And so, and I feel stressed out if I feel like I'm being wasteful or ignoring my friends. So being realistic about my bandwidth. But you know, the last thing is, don't take it so seriously. Because I think every deck I've purchased and every deck I've worked with has taught me something and has taken me on a journey. And, you know, I guess if I was purchasing really expensive indie decks, then that might be a bit more difficult. But honestly, if you purchase a deck that you don't love and you don't work with it a whole bunch, I mean, people purchase books all the time they don't read. Nobody makes them feel bad. So if I buy a deck, I want to be able to work with it, but I also try not to be too hard on myself if I don't. So I hope that you enjoyed what I had to say about my tarot library. And I would love to hear any comments or feedback you have for me. But I enjoyed going down this memory lane and also just really thinking about the thoughtful questions that were put forward in this tag. So thank you for watching this video. Please like it if you do. Consider subscribing if you want to hear more from me. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one. And until then, may our cards bring us truth bombs when we need them and gentleness when we don't. See you soon.